This is episode 10, Dimension 5, Direct Perception Part 2. Welcome back. In the previous episode, we began exploring the fifth dimension of seeing, direct perception. We distinguished direct perception from meeting the object. Direct perception is the immediate first contact with what appears. Meeting the object is allowing that contact to continue. We saw how quickly recognition arrives, how memory joins the present, how compassion, preference, labels, and stories begin gathering around what was first perceived. We also extended direct perception inward, towards thoughts, feelings, sensations, fear, anger, and even loneliness. And we discovered that an inner experience can be directly perceived before thought begins explaining it. But one important question remains. If direct perception is the first contact with reality, and if meeting the object means staying with that contact, why is that meeting so quickly lost? Why does the mind move so quickly, so rapidly from what is present to what it already knows? And once recognition, memory, comparison, or story has taken over, can we return? That is what we will explore today. Not how to hold direct perception permanently, not how to stop thought, not how to create a special state of mind, but how direct perception becomes obscured, how that movement can be noticed, and how seeing can begin again. The next section is about why direct perception is difficult. By now, direct perception may sound simple. Meet what is here before the mind completes the picture. Look before judging. Listen before concluding. Feel before explaining. Yet, when we try to remain with what is present, we quickly discover that it is remarkably difficult, not because we are doing something wrong, not because the mind is defective, but because the mind has spent an entire lifetime becoming extraordinarily efficient. From the beginning of life, we learn names, categories, patterns. What is safe? What is dangerous? What deserves attention? What can be ignored? This learning is necessary. Without it, we would have to rediscover the world every morning. But the same efficiency that helps us function can also shorten the meeting with what is actually present. The mind recognizes so quickly that it often feels as though recognition and perception were the same event. They are not. Perception meets what is here. Recognition places what is here inside what is already known. Both are valuable. The difficulty begins when the second movement becomes so quick that the first is barely allowed to continue. To understand why this happens, let us look at 4 movements that make direct perception difficult: conditioning, habit, the speed of thought, and familiarity. Now let us reflect on this section, which is about why direct perception is difficult. Think of a recent moment when you misunderstood someone or reacted too quickly. What happened immediately after the first perception? Did recognition arrive first? Did memory supply an old story? Did preference or fear begin selecting what mattered? At what point did direct perception quietly give way to interpretation? There is no need to judge the movement. Simply notice how quickly the mind moved from what was present to what it already knew. The single takeaway from this section on why direct perception is difficult is that direct perception is difficult not because reality is hidden, but because the mind is remarkably quick to replace what is present with what it already knows. The next section is on conditioning. Yesterday meets today. This was the first item that was identified in the previous section as to why direct perception is difficult. Every experience leaves some trace: a conversation, a success, a disappointment, a compliment, a criticism, a moment of fear, a moment of safety. Over time, these traces become part of the way we meet what happens next. This is conditioning. Conditioning is not mysterious. It is the accumulated influence of what life has taught us. Imagine a child who's repeatedly laughed at after making mistakes in class. Years later, as an adult, a manager says, "Could we talk for a moment?" The words are directly perceived, but almost immediately the body tightens. The stomach contracts. Thought appears. What have I done wrong? The manager may only want to discuss a new project, but yesterday has already entered today. The present words are being met together with many earlier experiences. Or imagine someone who was once bitten by a dog. Years later, another dog approaches. The present animal may be calm, it may show no sign of aggression, yet the body prepares before the present has fully revealed itself. Conditioning is trying to protect us. It uses the past to prepare for the future. The difficulty is not that the past appears. The difficulty is that its appearance may be mistaken for what is presently true. Direct perception asks us to notice both: the dog before us and the past entering the meeting, the manager's words and the old fear responding to them. When conditioning remains unseen, yesterday quietly speaks as though it were today. When it is seen, the past can inform the meeting without completely replacing it. Now let us reflect on this section, which is conditioning, which is about how yesterday meets today. Think of a present situation that repeatedly creates the same reaction in you: a certain tone of voice, a delayed reply, a disagreement, a person in authority. Ask yourself, what belongs to this moment? What may be arriving from the earlier moments? There is no need to reject the past. Simply notice when it begins speaking for the present. Now let us look at the single takeaway from this section on conditioning, which is about how yesterday meets today. Conditioning begins yesterday into today. Direct perception becomes clearer when we see the present object and the past that has entered the meeting without confusing one for the other. Now let us look at the second item identified in why direct perception is difficult, which is about habit. Habit meaning the mind follows familiar paths. Habit is another of the mind's great efficiencies. Because of habit, we do not have to relearn how to brush our teeth, tie our shoes, type on a keyboard, or even drive along a familiar road. Habit frees energy for other things. But habits do not remain limited to physical actions. We also develop habits of perception. Perhaps disagreement habitually feels like rejection. Silence feels like disapproval. Correction feels like humiliation. Delay feels like disrespect. After enough repetition, the mind no longer waits to discover what this particular situation contains. It travels down the familiar path. Imagine receiving a message that says, "Can we talk later?" One person becomes curious. Another becomes anxious. A third assumes that the conversation will be difficult. Another barely thinks about it. The object is identical. The established pathways are different. That is why a familiar response can feel like reality itself. It arrives before investigation, before evidence, before the object has had time to disclose more of itself. Meeting the object does not mean that habit must disappear. It means the habitual route is not allowed to become the only route. Perhaps the silence means rejection. Perhaps it does not. Perhaps the criticism is unfair. Perhaps there is something worth hearing. Staying with the object keeps the field open long enough for more than habit to speak. Now let us reflect on the section about the habit. Notice one reaction that seems to repeat itself in different situations. What does the mind habitually conclude? What familiar path does it follow? The next time that path begins, do not try to block it. Simply ask, is this what is here, or is this where my mind usually goes? The single takeaway from the section on habit is habits of perception answer before the present has fully spoken. Meeting the object keeps familiar conclusions from becoming the only conclusions available. The next section is on the speed of thought, which was a third item brought up in why direct perception is difficult. Thought does not usually enter slowly, it moves with extraordinary speed. Imagine hearing your name in a crowded room. Before you consciously decide to turn, you may already be looking towards the voice. Recognition is almost immediate. The same speed appears psychologically. Someone raises their voice within moments. The mind has concluded they are angry with me. They do not respect me. This always happens. By the time we become conscious of thinking, the story may already feel complete. Consider a broken cup on the kitchen floor. The pieces are directly perceived. Then thought moves. Who broke it? The children were here. They are always careless. A moment later, the family cat walks past. Only then does another possibility appear. The broken cup was real. The first story was not the cup. The speed of thought made the two seem inseparable. This is one of the central challenges of direct perception. The movement from observation to interpretation happens so quickly that we often do not experience a boundary between them. We feel that we simply saw what happened. In fact, we saw something and then the mind rapidly completed it. The purpose of slowing the movement down is not to make thought unnaturally slow. It is to become sensitive to sequence. What arrived first? What followed? At what point did the event become a story? Even noticing the sequence afterwards is valuable. At first, we may recognize the additions long after the reaction. Later, while the story is unfolding, and sometimes just as it begins, the gap between the experience and recognizing what the mind has added gradually becomes smaller. Now let us reflect on this section of the speed of thought. Think of a recent moment when you felt instantly certain about what something meant. What was directly perceived? What conclusion appeared next? How much time passed between them? Perhaps the conclusion was correct, but did it arrive after understanding or before it? The single takeaway from this section on the speed of thought is that thought moves so quickly that perception and interpretation often feel like one event. Seeing becomes clearer when we begin recognizing the sequence between what appeared and what the mind concluded. The next section is on familiarity, that is, when curiosity goes quiet. So this is the fourth item brought up in the section on why direct perception is difficult. There is another reason the object is often barely met. The familiar no longer seems to require looking. Think about the house in which you live. When you first entered it, you may have noticed the color of the walls, the view from the windows, the sounds at night, the way afternoon light entered a room. How much of that do you still notice? Probably very little, not because the house has stopped revealing itself, because recognition now says, I already know the place. Familiarity quietly brings looking to an end. The same thing happens in relationships. When we first meet someone, we ask questions, we listen carefully, we notice details. Years later, we may finish their sentences, predict their reactions, assume we know what they mean before they have finished speaking. The person has stopped changing. We have stopped discovering them. This is why the phrase, I know you, can contain both intimacy and danger. It can mean, I have spent years with you, but it can also mean, I no longer expect you to surprise me. Meeting the object allows familiarity and freshness to coexist. Yet, this is my partner, my child, my colleague, my street, my own familiar thought, and yet this moment has never existed before. The invitation is not to pretend the familiar is unknown, it is to remember that knowing the name, history, or function of something does not exhaust what is present now. Now let us reflect on the section on familiarity. Choose something deeply familiar, a room, a routine, a person, your own face in the mirror. Ask, what have I stopped seeing because I believe I already know it? Do not force novelty. Simply remain long enough for one unnoticed detail to appear. Now let us take a look at the single takeaway from the section on familiarity. Familiarity tells us that nothing more needs to be seen. Direct perception returns when recognition remains useful without bringing curiosity to an end. The next section is to actually clarify why the mind is not the enemy. At this point, it would be easy to misunderstand the inquiry, to conclude that conditioning is bad, habit is bad, recognition is bad, thought is bad. That is not what we are saying. Conditioning helps us learn from experience. Habit allows us to function efficiently. Recognition makes language and practical life possible. Thought allows us to reason, plan, communicate, and even solve problems. The mind's additions are not enemies of reality. The problem begins when they become invisible and therefore appear to be reality itself. Memory may be relevant, a label may be useful, a comparison may clarify something. An interpretation may be accurate. Direct perception does not require rejecting any of them. It asks that we see their relationship to what came first. The words, "Can we talk?" were perceived. The fear that followed was also real as an inner experience. But the fear was not contained in the words. It arose through conditioning, memory, and interpretation. When this distinction is visible, thought returns to its appropriate place. It can assess seeing without impersonating what is seen. So let's look at the takeaway from this section on the mind is not the enemy. Thought is not the opposite of seeing. Difficulty begins when what thought adds becomes indistinguishable from what was directly perceived. The next section is on returning to direct perception. After seeing how quickly the mind recognizes, remembers, compares, and interprets, a natural question arises: how do we return to direct perception? We may expect the answer to involve a technique, a special meditation, a breathing exercise, a method for stopping thought, or a way for remaining permanently in the present. But the return may be much simpler. We return when we notice that the object has been replaced by what the mind has added. Imagine looking at a rose. There is color, texture, light. Then recognition says rose. Memory follows. My grandmother loved roses. Preference enters. I prefer white roses. Comparison enters. The roses last spring were more fragrant. Nothing needs to be suppressed. The return begins with seeing the movement. Recognition has arrived. The memory has arrived. Comparison is now shaping the meeting. The rose remains present. The thoughts remain present. But the relationship has changed. The additions are no longer silently standing in place of the flower. They are being seen, as additions, and the object becomes available to be met again. Returning does not mean going backwards to the thoughtless instant. It means allowing what is present now to be seen together with the movement of thought now. The return is not a restoration of the original second. It is a fresh meeting in this second. The next section is on how awareness changes the relationship. In the earlier episode on awareness, we distinguished between basic awareness from meta-awareness. That distinction becomes important here. The mind may be fully engaged in an experience without recognizing the movement taking place within it. Then a movement of meta-awareness appears. I have been replaying that conversation. I have already decided what this person means. My mind is predicting the outcome. The story may not immediately stop. The feeling may remain, the uncertainty may continue, but something fundamental has changed. We are no longer only inside the movement itself has become visible. Imagine watching a film. For a while you are absorbed in the story, then something reminds you that you are sitting in a cinema. The film continues, but your relationship to it changes. Thought can be similar. A thought appears. Another follows. Soon an entire private conversation is unfolding. Then there is recognition. I am thinking. The thoughts are still there, but they are no longer the only feel. Meta-awareness does not create direct perception. It reveals that interpretation has taken over, making a fresh meeting possible. This is why awareness and direct perception support one another without being the same dimension. Direct perception is the immediate contact with what appears. Meeting the object allows that contact to continue. Awareness recognizes what is happening within the meeting. Now let us look at a takeaway from the section on awareness changes the relationship. Awareness does not produce direct perception. It reveals when thought has replaced the object, allowing a fresh meeting with what is present. The next section is on returning to direct perception in everyday life. Consider the message once more. Can we talk later? The mind immediately begins, something is wrong. I must have upset them. This will not end well. Then a moment of recognition occurs. My mind is already creating the conversation. The uncertainty does not vanish. The future remains unknown, but the imagined conversation is no longer being mistaken for the conversation itself. The words can be met again as words. Or imagine driving home. Another driver cuts into your lane. The body reacts. Heat rises. Thought says, "What an idiot." One thought becomes another. Perhaps the incident continues internally after the car has disappeared. Then you notice the event is over, the mind is continuing it. That seeing is already a return, not necessarily to calmness, not to forgiveness, but to the reality of what is now happening. The car is gone, the body is still activated, thought is still replaying the event. Each of these can now be met as it is. Or consider a familiar relationship. Your partner begins speaking. Before the sentence is complete, the mind says, I know where this is going. Then you notice that prediction. The return may be as small as allowing the sentence to finish, listening to these words, rather than to all earlier conversations that seem to accompany them. Returning to direct perception is often that ordinary. One more look, one more moment, one more willingness to let the present speak before the past completes it. The next section is on returning to direct perception again and again. Many people imagine direct perception as a state that can be achieved and preserved, as though one day the mind will remain permanently free of memory, comparison, preference, and interpretation. But that may be the wrong image. Direct perception is not a finish line. It is a continual possibility of fresh contact. Imagine listening to music. For a while, there is listening. Then the mind moves to tomorrow's meeting, or something forgotten, or a private memory. A minute later, you recognize, I have not been listening. You do not have to criticize yourself, you simply listen again. The same is true throughout life. Memory begins louder than the present. We return. Comparison replaces listening. We return. A label replaces the person. We return. Fear turns a possibility into a certainty. We return. Not because every return will last, but because each return is itself a moment of seeing. There is no final stage of direct perception to achieve. There are simply fresh moments of meeting. At first, we may recognize a movement long afterwards, later while it is unfolding, and sometimes almost as it begins. The gap between experiences and recognition. The next section is on how transformation begins with seeing. There is an important difference between seeing a movement and controlling it. Suppose someone speaks harshly to you. Anger arises. One response is to suppress it, to smile when the anger continues beneath the surface. Another response is to release it immediately, to defend, attack, or retaliate. Direct perception and awareness introduce another possibility. First, meet what has appeared, the tightening, the heat, the surge of energy, the thought preparing its reply. Nothing has yet been approved or condemned. Nothing has been suppressed. The movement is being seen. Sometimes what is fully seen begins to lose momentum, not because it has been ordered to disappear, but because the interpretation sustaining it has become invisible. Perhaps the stone. The next section is on bringing it all together. Let us bring the two parts of this exploration together. Something appears, a bird, a rose, a familiar face, a message, a sensation, a thought, and an emotion. There is an immediate first contact. That is direct perception. If the contact is allowed to continue, the object begins to reveal more of itself. That is meeting the object. Then recognition enters. Memory, conditioning, comparison, preference, labels, interpretation. These movements are very natural. They become an obstacle only when they replace what they were meant to help us understand. The difficulty is increased by conditioning, habit, speed, and familiarity. Yesterday enters today. Familiar pathways answer before observation. Thought compares the picture before the facts arrive. And familiarity tells us there is nothing left to discover. Then awareness reveals what has happened. The mind is adding. That recognition creates the possibility of a fresh meeting. Not the recovery of a pure moment that has passed, but direct contact with what is present now, the person now, the feeling now, the thought now, and the situation now. This is why direct perception is both the beginning of seeing and something to which seeing continually returns. We have reached to the end of this episode, so let us look at what the conclusion is. As we come to the end of this two-part exploration, let us return to the simple question with which we began. What happens before the mind finishes telling us what we are seeing? For a brief moment, reality arrives, then the mind responds, it recognizes it, remembers, compares, prefers, labels, and interprets. Part 1 explored that unfolding. Today we explored why the first meeting is so quickly obscured and how seeing can begin again. Perhaps direct perception is not a rare or elevated state. It is the immediate contact already occurring throughout the day. The question is whether the object is allowed to remain long enough to be met, or whether thought immediately takes its place. And when thought does take its place, nothing has been permanently lost. The present is still here. The person is still here. The feeling is still here. The movement of thought is also here. All of it can be met again. Perhaps seeing reality is not about never leaving the object. Perhaps it is about reorganizing when we have left and being willing to look again. The final reflection of this episode is, as you move through tomorrow, choose one ordinary movement. A familiar person speaking, a message arriving, a feeling beginning, a thought repeating itself. Notice the first contact. Then notice what enters: memory, habit, expectation, comparison, or even a story. Do not try to prevent the movement. Simply notice when the object is no longer being met on its own. Then look again. You may discover that returning to reality requires no special achievement, only the willingness to meet what is here now. An overall takeaway from this episode is direct perception is the immediate first contact with reality. Meeting the object allows that contact to continue. When conditioning, habit, familiarity, or thought replaces the object, awareness makes a fresh meeting possible. This is the last section in this episode. It is about transitioning to the next dimension, which is inference. Throughout these two episodes, part 1 and part 2, we have explored what can be known through direct perception, what can be seen, heard, touched, tasted, smelled, or even directly observed within ourselves. But if we relied only on direct perception, our understanding would remain incomplete. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing smoke above the trees. You do not directly perceive the fire, yet the smoke gives you reason to conclude that one may be present. Or imagine finding muddy footprints across your hallway. You did not see anyone enter, yet the marks below you to reason beyond what was directly perceived. Every day we move from evidence to conclusion. We connect what is seen with what are difficult to see directly. This movement is called inference. Inference is essential to science, medicine, history, and ordinary human life. But inference also raises a difficult question. When is a conclusion well supported, and when is it only an assumption that feels convincing? That question will lead us into the next dimension of seeing. Until then, when the mind says, I already know, perhaps pause for one moment and look again. Not because thought is wrong, but because reality may still have something more to reveal. Before we close, I would like to leave you with a simple image. Imagine a soft pillow in the shape of the earth, a soft earth, and imagine yourself holding it gently, hugging it, giving it all the love you can. Because this earth includes all of us, humanity, animals, plants, the environment, everything living together on this small planet. Perhaps from time to time we can return to this image, a soft earth held with care. If you found something meaningful in this episode, please tell others about it. This is first steps to seeing reality, and perhaps the first step is simply to begin noticing. Thank you for listening.